Alrighty, so in this video, I'm going to go through the solutions to the IB Economics Higher Level Paper 1. This is the October/November 2022 paper. Now, in a previous videos, we'd already gone through question 1 and the first part, and question 2 part A. And this video, I'm going to go through the second bit, question 2 part B, and this guy's worth 15 marks. All right, so this question is asking us to use real-world examples to discuss the potential trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Okay, so this question, so you've got unemployment and inflation, so two key concepts. So this question is really about this thing called the Phillips curve, which shows us the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation in an economy. In other words, if you want low unemployment, this will come at the cost of high inflation. But if you want to keep inflation low, then this will come at the cost of high unemployment. So it's kind of like picking which option is less bad and going with that. So for example, if you think it's really important to keep unemployment low right now, then government can implement certain policies to achieve this, like reducing interest rates, but this will generally result in inflation at some future point. In the following solution, we're going to unpack all this. Now, as usual, we're going to start with a section to define key terms. Then we're going to have a couple of diagrams along with some commentary to explain their meaning. This will be followed by a discussion on theory and explanation, and we'll finish up with a couple of real-world examples. Okay, so let's begin with key terms over here. So there are about 4 key terms which I think are relevant here. These being unemployment, obviously, inflation, the Phillips curve, and the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so in terms of unemployment, how do we define this? What's the kind of like the textbook definition of unemployment? It is the percentage of the labor force that is actively seeking work but unable to find employment at prevailing wage rates. It's essentially the number of people that want, as a percentage of the labor force, that want to find work but effectively just can't find work for whatever reason. The second important term that we have to define here is inflation, which is the sustained rise in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. It's measured by the Consumer Price Index. Sometimes referred to as the CPI. So it's commonly measured by the CPI. There's other ways to measure it, but CPI is probably the more common one. Then we've got this thing called the Phillips curve, which is a theoretical representation showing the inverse short-run relationship between unemployment and inflation, suggesting that as unemployment decreases, inflation tends to rise and vice versa. Right, so the Phillips curve is really this picture that kind of shows us this inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment, meaning that you can't have both. Either you have one or you have the other, but you can't have both. And the last concept is this thing called the natural rate of unemployment, which is the level of unemployment that exists when the economy is at full employment, accounting for frictional and structural unemployment. At this point, there is no cyclical unemployment, and the economy is considered to be in long-run equilibrium. Right, so the natural rate of unemployment is just kind of like as the name implies, like the normal level of unemployment that exists within an economy at any given period of time. So it's not realistic to expect everyone to be working all of the time. So you're always going to have, like, for reasons, you're going to have a bunch of people that are without work. Typically, this natural rate might sit, kind of like around 5%, thereabouts. Okay, so that about does it for the key terms. Let's move on to the next section, which is on diagram. So here, I'm going to use two diagrams. The first is going to be a model of aggregate demand and supply, which you should be familiar with. And the second is we're going to see how this maps out onto the Phillips curve. Right? So the second diagram is going to be the Phillips curve. Okay, so on the left side, hopefully I've got space for this. I'm going to start with the aggregate demand and supply curve. So here we've got some sort of downward sloping aggregate demand curve. I'll call this like 81, and I'll have like a second aggregate demand curve. I'll call this like 82. And we'll have some sort of short run aggregate supply curve that sort of goes up like this. We have prices on the vertical axes and something like our GDP on the horizontal. And we begin perhaps at point A and might move to say point B at let's say Y1 and Y2. And at point A we might be at let's say P1, and at point B will be at P2. Then over on the right-hand side, I want to draw this thing called the Phillips curve. So we'll call this, I'll label this, I'll just call this Phillips curve. And on the Phillips curve, we're going to have inflation on the vertical axes. So that's inflation rate, so maybe in percentages. And then on the horizontal axes, we're going to have something like the unemployment rate. So again, in percentages. And the Phillips curve is going to kind of be this downward sloping sort of inverse thing, just kind of showing us that, let's say at point, well, let's begin at point A. Ooh, kind of run out of space here. I'll just move that over. We'll call this the unemployment rate. And so at point A, we're going to have some sort of we're going to have relatively high unemployment at U1, but we get away with kind of low inflation. We'll call that sort of like P1, pi 1 at this level over here. Now, as we move from A to B, so let's say for whatever reason, if the government's able to engineer this increase in aggregate demand, then the AD curve is going to shift from 81 to 82, and the equilibrium is going to move from point A to B. And so on our Phillips curve, we're going to go backwards from point A to B. And so the nifty thing is, by doing this, by growing the economy, by growing aggregate demand, we're going to have this reduction in unemployment. So unemployment's going to come down, but it's going to come at the cost of higher inflation. So as we move from A to B, you can see inflation is going to rise from, say, pi 1 to pi 2. Right, so this is kind of the pair of diagrams that I think would most illustrate this concept of the Phillips curve, right? So the main thing is really sort of over here, as we see, as we move from, say, A to B, we have this reduction in unemployment, but at the same time, we have this rise in the inflation rate. And as usual, I just want to make sure that you label your diagrams. So down here, it's got like, where AD equals aggregate demand, and SRAS equals your short-run aggregate supply, etc. So this is kind of standard. If you don't really understand what this stuff is, then I encourage you to go back and review your notes. But yeah, this is a very standard aggregate demand, aggregate supply sort of model of the economy. Okay, so as usual, we're going to have to provide some commentary to go along with this. So I've said that in this diagram, we show how increasing aggregate demand can lead to low unemployment, but higher inflation. So let's kind of move through let's kind of provide some commentary. The economy starts at point A, where AD1 intersects AS at price level P1 and output Y1. So as usual, got to do a cleanup. So the economy starts at point A, where AD, so the aggregate demand curve, intersects, I guess, short aggregate supply at price P1 and output level Y1. So that's kind of showing us that first bit where we're over here at point A, and everything kind of begins at normal, sort of in normal conditions. Now, suppose we have some sort of improvement or some sort of increase in aggregate demand. Maybe the government reduces interest rates, or whatever. So If the government stimulates the economy, for example, through fiscal or monetary policy, AD shifts from 81 to 82. This increase in demand leads to higher output Y2 at a higher price level P2. So aggregate demand shifts from 81 to 82. So here we're saying that if the government were to do something, either monetary policy or fiscal policy, they're going to grow the economy and aggregate demand is going to shift from 81 to 82. So here comes the trade-off, right? At Y2, the economy experiences lower unemployment due to increased production, but the price level also rises, causing inflation. So here we see that as we move from A to B, now output is going to rise from Y1 to Y2. That's good. We're going to grow the economy, but the trade-off is that prices rise. Now, as we go from Y1 to Y2, as demand grows, firms have to hire more workers to keep up with this increase in demand. And so unemployment falls from U1 to U2, but then we're left with this higher rate of inflation. This unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment and results in an increase in inflation from pi 1 to pi 2 as depicted by the Phillips curve. Oh, nearly got everything there. So we'll call it, let's say, pi 1 to pi 2 as depicted by the Phillips curve. So here we see that as we move from A to B, we have that reduction in unemployment, but that also accompanied by that rise in inflation from pi 1 to pi 2. Okay, so that about does it, I think, for the diagram. So we've got a diagram, it's properly labeled, and then we have a bit of commentary to accompany that diagram. I think that, that'll probably get you sort of full marks. Next, we're going to have a section here on sort of the theory and explanation. In the short run, there is a potential trade-off between unemployment and inflation due to the relationship between economic output and price levels. As an economy grows and aggregate demand increases, firms tend to hire more workers to meet the rise in demand. This reduces unemployment, but at the same time, higher demand puts upward pressure on prices, leading to inflation. This short-run trade-off is illustrated by the Phillips curve, which suggests that a decrease in unemployment often leads to an increase in inflation. The reasoning is that as labor markets tighten, workers gain more bargaining power, pushing up wages. Higher wages increase production costs, which businesses pass on to consumers in the form of higher prices, leading to inflation. Right, so what we're saying here is that as the economy grows, more people get jobs to satisfy the additional levels of demand. But as more people get jobs, then overall income levels rise and consumption soon follows. More consumption means more demand, and this places upward pressure on prices, and this results in inflation. I should make a side note that this kind of inflation is known as demand pull inflation and is generally regarded as better than the other types of inflation, such as cost push, but that's a topic for a different discussion. Okay, so what we're saying is that a tight labor market, which is one where there's strong demand for labor as firms have to hire workers to satisfy demand, workers have a lot of bargaining power and they will usually negotiate for higher wages. Given that labor demand is very strong, their likelihood of success increases, and if this happens, then firms have to pay their workers more. Firms will in turn pass on these higher costs to the consumer in the form of higher prices, and this is how inflation develops. Okay, so next I'm going to introduce an extra diagram here. I'm going to show the long run Phillips curve versus the short run, because we're going to have a bit of a discussion about this as well. So I'm going to just draw this. Oops, maybe. Give me 1 second. Okay. So we've got, let's say, maybe it's like a short run Phillips curve. So let's say we'll call this Phillips curve 1, and maybe we'll call it like maybe Phillips curve 2. And we have maybe 1 Phillips curve. Pi for inflation and U for unemployment. Oh, we'll call this unemployment. And we're going to have this UN, or natural rate of unemployment. Let's say maybe 3% for point A, so let's say pi equals 3%. And let's say at point B, we might have, let's say 6% inflation. So pi equals 6% for that second Phillips curve. Okay, so I'm going to explain everything, right? So don't freak out if you don't kind of understand what this is going on about. In the long run, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation breaks down. This is because the economy is expected to return to the natural rate of unemployment, sometimes abbreviated to N, like NAIRU, or we've got different abbreviations, but sometimes it's just referred to as NRU, which is the rate consistent with full employment when the economy is in long-run equilibrium. According to new classical economics and monetary theorists, no, it should be a monetarist theory, beg your pardon. Monetarist theory. For example, Milton Friedman. Attempts to lower unemployment below the NRU through demand-side policies. For example, increasing aggregate demand, will only result in higher inflation in the long run, without permanently lowering unemployment. This is because, in the short run, increased demand may reduce unemployment as firms hire more workers to meet rising demand. However, over time, workers and firms adjust their expectations. If inflation rises due to higher demand, workers demand higher wages to keep up with rising prices. Higher wages increase firms' costs, leading them to raise prices further. As prices rise, the real value of wages falls and unemployment returns to its natural rate. Its natural rate. It's going to dot point this a little. Okay, it's looking a lot nicer. In the long run, inflation remains high, but unemployment returns to its natural rate, leading to a vertical Phillips curve. This long-run perspective is depicted by the vertical Phillips curve at the NRU, indicating that there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the long run. So what all this is essentially saying is that this trade-off between unemployment and inflation, it only exists in the short run. In the long run, there is no trade-off. You can't get unemployment below its natural rate, and any attempt to do so will only result in more inflation. This is the reason why the long-run Phillips curve is vertical. So here we've got this vertical sort of long-run Phillips curve. It's meant to show us that there is no relationship between unemployment and inflation in the long run. In the short run, you can get away with it, right? So in the short run, you can kind of like manipulate or lower unemployment or inflation, depending on what you're trying to do through this government policy. However, in the long run, you can't get away with that, because what's going to happen is that in the long run, the economy will always return to its natural rate of unemployment. And so if you try to grow the economy, if you try to sort of mechanically reduce unemployment, say through monetary or fiscal policy, then this will only work in the short run, but in the long run, the economy will always go back to its natural rate, and all you're going to end up with is higher levels of inflation. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And let's just finish off with a couple of real-world examples. So in terms of examples, there's really a couple that come to mind. These being the first example I can think of is what happened following the COVID-19 pandemic, and the second is this period of stagflation that occurred during the 1970s during the oil crisis. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, the US economy recovered quickly, spurred by expansionary fiscal policies. For example, stimulus checks. And low interest rates from the Federal Reserve. As a result, unemployment dropped rapidly, but inflation surged. The unemployment rate fell from a pandemic peak of 14.8% in April 2020 to below 4% by 2021, 2022. Inflation rose sharply in 2021, reaching over 6% by the end of the year. The highest in nearly 4 decades. as pent-up demand, supply chain disruptions, and wage pressures pushed prices higher. The post-COVID recovery in the US showed a short-run Phillips curve dynamic. Let's fix this up. Should be period. With the rapid reduction in unemployment being accompanied by a sharp increase in inflation. However, supply chain issues and other pandemic-related factors suggest that the Phillips curve may not fully capture the inflationary pressures, as these were not solely demand-driven. However, in the 1970s, the US experienced a period of stagflation, where both unemployment and inflation were high. This contradicted the Phillips curve theory that suggests that there should be an inverse relationship between the two. Stagflation occurred largely due to supply shocks such as the oil crisis, which increased production costs and led to both rising prices, inflation, and reduced output, causing higher unemployment. Right. So what we have here are two examples of where first we see the Phillips curve effect working, and in the second example, we actually don't see the Phillips curve effect, right? We see this breakdown in the relationship between unemployment and inflation. So the first example was during the COVID pandemic. We saw that unemployment peaked. The government sort of freaked out, and then they implemented all these measures to try to keep unemployment down. So they, for example, they used stimulus checks, they dropped interest rates and all that sort of stuff. As a result, unemployment rates fell, but what we saw like a year later is that inflation at the same time, inflation rose to its highest level in nearly 40 years. So we see that trade-off, that short-term trade-off between unemployment and inflation during the COVID pandemic. But we also see that back in the 70s, this relationship sort of broke down during sort of the oil crisis. So in that scenario, we saw stagflation, where we had both high inflation and high unemployment as well. So that kind of contradicts the Phillips curve theory. Okay, so I think that about does it for this question. As you can see, we've pretty much done everything we have to do. We went through some key, we defined a few key terms. We had a diagram followed by some commentary, and then we explained some of the theory behind this diagram, and then we finished off with a couple of real-world examples. So I think if you're able to do something like this, or produce something similar to this, then that should probably get you close to full marks for this type of question. Okay, hope that helps. I'll see you in the next one.